Testament. Our examination of vocabulary to this point has revealed a good deal of continuity. Members of the heavenly host are referred to in the Old Testament and Second Temple Jewish literature in much the same way, though some of the vocabulary of the former is not repeated in the latter. There were also innovations in angelology during the Second Temple period, along with quite a bit of speculation. The New Testament shows marked differences with respect to both the Old Testament and Second Temple literature. New Testament angelology is rooted in the Old Testament, but has much less variety in its vocabulary for the heavenly host. It also shows little interest in innovation and speculation of Second Temple Jewish literature. Note: this is true of good members of the heavenly host. When it comes to demonology, which is not the focus of this book, the New Testament follows Second Temple Jewish literature and its development of Old Testament ideas in discernible, important ways. Endnote. New Testament terminology for the heavenly host. The vocabulary choices of New Testament authors can be easily misunderstood. For example, the plural of theos, God, gods, is found in the New Testament only 8 times. It would be incoherent to see this as a rejection of Old Testament thinking about the supernatural. Rather, the limited use is pragmatic. New Testament writers use divine plurality language when needed, such as in citation of an Old Testament passage, a reference to pagan, Gentile idols, or some point of Gentile religion. It is quite evident that Paul, for instance, considered the gods of the Old Testament to be actual sinister entities. In 1 Corinthians 8, 1-6, Paul tells the Corinthians that there were indeed other gods, theoi, and lords, kurioi, worshipped by people instead of Yahweh and Jesus, entities that Paul, following the Septuagint of Deuteronomy 32:17, considered demons. Note: when it comes to demonological vocabulary, both the Septuagint and the New Testament conflate the Old Testament vocabulary for foreign gods and idols to daimon or daimonion. By the Hellenistic era, this term in Jewish circles was broadly used for entities hostile to God. English translations regularly obscure Paul's thinking by putting theoi in quotation marks, creating the impression that Paul wasn't serious. The same translations regularly take the common Greek lemma lego, to say, speak, and render it so-called, to create the same misleading impression. There is nothing cryptic about Paul's statement. 1 Corinthians 8, 5-6 should be straightforwardly translated. For although there are those called gods and lords in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ. Paul's theology is precisely in line with Old Testament writers who affirm multiple Elohim, but only one Yahweh. That Paul was serious is indicated in his reference to these same gods and lords in 1 Corinthians 10, 21-22, where he calls them demons, in quoting the Septuagint of Deuteronomy 32:17, where they are called Elohim and Shedim. The latter Hebrew term denotes territorial entities to whom Israelites sacrificed in the place of Yahweh. The term makes good sense in the context of the Deuteronomy 32:8 worldview of the Old Testament. Endnote. Paul feared the Corinthians would be participants with demons if they ate sacrificial meat. Note: Paul does not contradict himself here with respect to his conclusion 2 chapters earlier that we are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do. An idol was indeed nothing, but the entity who was thought to indwell the idol was a different matter. Paul allowed eating the meat that was sold in the marketplace, but apparently any connection to the altar, in other words, the sacrificial ritual, meant fellowship with demons. This had to be avoided because it amounted to worship of foreign gods, akin to Israel's failure, which is contextualized by Deuteronomy 32:17, where the demons, shedim in the Septuagint, daimonios, are gods, Elohim, theoi in the Septuagint. Endnote. The same caution about drawing erroneous conclusions in regard to New Testament vocabulary is appropriate given the virtual absence of other terms found in the Old Testament or Second Temple Jewish thought. The New Testament uses holy ones only once of celestial, non-human beings, and that instance is drawing on material from a pseudepigraphal book. This infrequency of usage would not lead us to the conclusion that New Testament writers didn't think the members of the heavenly host were holy, or that God's presence was void of other heavenly beings. New Testament references to sons of God or children of God refer to human believers, glorified or not. Note, all other references to sons of God or children of God in the New Testament have believers, glorified or otherwise, in view. End note. We would be quite wrong if we concluded that New Testament writers thought that angels were not created by God as spirit children, or that they thought there was something theologically amiss about the phrase sons of God. Note, indeed, as I have explained elsewhere, this language used of believers is intentionally drawn from the Old Testament vocabulary for God's spirit children. End note. New Testament writers had their own focus points. There was no need to rehearse Old Testament angelology in their writings. Ontological language, that is, spirits, is frequently employed and qualified with adjectives, evil spirits, to describe demons, a term that is itself ontological. Demon is actually a transliteration of the Greek daemon, or the related daimonion, which in classical Greek literature describes any supernatural being without regard to its disposition, good or evil. A daimon can be a god or goddess, a lesser supernatural being, or even the disembodied spirit of a human. Consequently, daimon is semantically akin to Hebrew Elohim. Gospel writers use daimon in combination with descriptive phrases like evil, unclean spirits, and so daimonion in the New Testament nearly always points to a disembodied entity hostile to God. Note, the one exception is Acts 17:18, where Gentiles, Greeks, listening to Paul opine, he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities, daimonion. The New Testament is silent on the origin of demons. The origin of demons in Jewish texts outside the Bible, such as 1 Enoch, is attributed to the events of Genesis 6:1-4. When a Nephilim was killed in these texts, its disembodied spirit was considered a demon. These demons then roamed the earth to harass humans. End note. These supernatural fallen spirits are also cast as fallen or wandering stars. Outside the Gospels, particularly in the writings of Paul, vocabulary for the powers of darkness is characteristically described with functional or role terminology. Most of Paul's terms for the powers of darkness describe geographical rulership. The word choices make good sense given the content of Deuteronomy 32:8-9 and Psalm 82, which explained the origin and corruption of the fallen sons of God assigned to the nations by Yahweh. Paul understood and presumed the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Rulers, archonton or archon, principalities, arche, powers, authorities, exousia, powers, dunamis, dominions, lords, kurios, thrones, thronos, world rulers, cosmokrator. These lemmas have something in common. They were used both in the New Testament and other Greek literature to denote geographical domain authority. At times, these terms are used of humans, but several instances demonstrate that Paul had spiritual beings in mind. With respect to the faithful members of the heavenly host, the vocabulary of the New Testament is more functional than ontological. Ontological vocabulary is occasionally used to describe God's servants. They are occasionally described as spirits. Note, the adjective pneumatikos is used once in the plural as a general ontological designation of supernatural beings hostile to God. Its remaining plural occurrences, the lemma points to or describes spiritual service, truths, blessings, gifts, songs, or human believers themselves. End note. Heavenly ones, epuranioi, glorious ones, doxai, lights, photon, holy ones, hagiais, and possibly stars. Note: on the star designation for the angels of the 7 churches in Revelation, see chapter 7. Not all scholars see the angels associated with the churches as divine beings. 2 instances of spirits require comment. Hebrews 12:29, God is the Father of spirits, is either neutral or refers to God as the source of the human spirit breath. If the former trajectory is followed, the term would credit God with creating all divine beings regardless of their loyal or fallen status. Hebrews 12:23 clearly refers to redeemed human souls. James 1:17 refers to God as the Father of lights, a phrase that calls to mind the Old Testament and Second Temple Jewish notion that stars were heavenly beings. The term stoicheia, elemental principles, is excluded from this list of ontological terms for good angels. In the 2 passages where this term, at least in part, arguably refers to divine beings, instead of, apparently, the material components of the natural world, or first principles of the Mosaic Law, the reference would be fallen supernatural beings. As I wrote in The Unseen Realm, there is no consensus among scholars on Paul's use of the term. The question is whether Paul is using the term of spiritual entities, star deities, in Galatians 4:3 and 9, and Colossians 2:8 and 20. 3 of these 4 instances append the word to of the world, cosmos, in other words, stoicheia of the world. But this doesn't provide much clarity. Paul's discussion in Galatians 4 and Colossians 2 includes spiritual forces, angels, principalities and powers, false gods, in the context, which suggests stoicheia may refer to divine beings. He is contrasting stoicheia to salvation in Christ in some way. Since Paul is speaking to both Jews and Gentiles, he might also be using the term in different ways with respect to each audience. Stoicheia as law would make little sense to Gentiles, though it would strike a chord with Jews. My view is that in Galatians 4:3, Paul's use of stoicheia likely refers to the law and religious teaching with a Jewish audience in view. The audience shifts to Gentiles in 4:8-11, and so it seems coherent to see stoicheia in Galatians 4:9 as referring to divine beings, probably astral deities, the fates. Galatians 4:8 transitions to pagans, since the Jews would have known about the true God. The reference to times and seasons and years would therefore point to astrological beliefs, not the Jewish calendar. Paul is therefore denying the idea that the celestial objects, sun, moon, and stars, are deities. His Gentile readers should not be enslaved by the idea that these objects controlled their destiny. Endnote. New Testament writers seldom qualify the term angel with holy. However, angels are associated with heaven. The functional word angel, angelos, is by far the principal New Testament moniker for celestial beings in the service of God. The label, effectively a job description, messenger, communicates assistance from heaven. Only 4 of the 175 occurrences of angelos point to fallen divine beings. Note: the reason should be clear. If a spirit being isn't serving God, it would be working against God along with other fallen divine beings. The devil, linked in Second Temple literature and the New Testament with the serpent Nachash of Eden, has primary status apparently due to being the original rebel, made ruler of the underworld, the place in ancient cosmology opposite to the abode of God. A link between the sons of God who fell before the flood to the devil becomes prominent in Second Temple Jewish literature. The idea can, in fact, be tied to the Old Testament if one is aware, as a number of Second Temple Jewish authors were, of the Mesopotamian Babylonian background to Genesis 6:1-4. Endnote. For New Testament authors, angelos is a catch-all term for the supernatural agents who faithfully attend God. The varied vocabulary of the Old Testament and Second Temple Jewish literature is therefore largely conflated into angelos. In accord with the Old Testament, the New Testament names only 2 angels, Michael and Gabriel. There is therefore far less interest in specific angels than found in Second Temple literature. Unlike the Old Testament emphasis on the angel of Yahweh, and the space devoted to angelic second Yahweh figures, Melchizedek, the Prince of Light, the Heavenly Man, Yahoel, in Second Temple literature, the New Testament's focus is on Christ. Note: the phrase angel of the Lord occurs 11 times in the New Testament. The very similar angel of God occurs twice. In no case can it be exegetically argued that the phrase points to the same figure as the Old Testament angel of the Lord. Part of the problem is the disconnect between the fact that translating the corresponding Hebrew phrase into English requires a definite translation, the angel of Yahweh the Lord, due to the grammar and syntax of the Hebrew construct relationship with a noun of deity as nomen rectum. That said, there are rare occasions where an English indefinite translation of a Hebrew noun construct phrase referring to a deity could be appropriate. For instance, 1 Samuel 16:23 and 18:10 have Ruach Elohim, where the meaning cannot be the Spirit of God, in other words, the Holy Spirit. Two earlier references make the context clear, through modification by an adjective, that an evil spirit from God is meant. Typically, though, the Hebrew construct relationship involving a specific deity requires definiteness. Greek grammar is more flexible, requiring neither the article for definiteness nor that a phrase involving a deity noun be semantically definite. Greek can omit the article before the noun in syntactical relationship to another genitive case noun, thereby creating the possibility that the first noun is indefinite. The only New Testament instance of the article occurring before angelos in the phrase angel of the Lord is Matthew 1:24. Utilizing Wallace's chart on article usage and semantics, the use of the article in Matthew 1:24 is best understood as anaphoric, referring back to the preceding mention, where there was no article, of this same angel in Matthew 1:20. There is nothing to suggest that the article is monadic, pointing to a unique angel. Further, it is fascinating to note that when New Testament writers unambiguously cite or allude to Old Testament passages where the focus is the angel of Yahweh, they do not use the phrase angel of the Lord. In this writer's judgment, the only instance where the New Testament writer may have the angel of Yahweh, who was Yahweh, in view is Revelation 1. If this is the case, then John identifies the risen Christ with the angel. This would be expected, given the identification of the angel of Yahweh with Yahweh in the Old Testament, and the use of that identification by New Testament writers to link Jesus and Yahweh. Given the heavenly post-resurrection context, there would be no conflict with the second person of the Trinity coming in human form as the angel of Yahweh prior to that person's incarnation as Jesus. The point of Revelation 1 would be to identify this angel with the later human Jesus. The phrase, who is and who was and who is to come, in Revelation 1:4, is derived from the Septuagint of Exodus 3:14, the revelation of the divine name from the burning bush, in which the angel of Yahweh appeared, and is closely related to the description of Jesus as the Alpha and Omega. The problem with this identification is Revelation 22:16, where it is apparently Jesus, rather than God the Father, who sent the angel to John. However, this verse could merely be another way to co-identify Jesus and God. In any event, an explicit reference to the angel of the Lord does not occur in Revelation. Endnote. For New Testament writers, the second power became incarnate in Jesus Christ. The obvious exception to New Testament indifference toward exalted angels is the scant attention paid to archangels. The term archangelos is found only twice. The instance in 1 Thessalonians 4:16 makes reference to the role of at least one archangel in the proclamation of the return of Christ. No specific archangel is mentioned. Michael receives the title once in Jude 9, where the archangel contends with the devil about the body of Moses. This puzzling passage is most often thought to harken back to passages such as Zechariah 3, where Hasatan, the adversary, accuses Joshua, the high priest. Baucham's thoughts are representative. The devil, in his ancient role as accuser, tried to establish Moses' guilt in order to prove him unworthy of honorable burial and to claim the body for himself. Baucham's discussion of Jude 9 has much to commend it, especially its assemblage of Second Temple literature that might contribute to the strange episode, but it is ultimately untenable because associating Zechariah 3 with the devil depends on violating Hebrew grammar. Note: as noted in chapter 2, the adversary in passages like Job 1-2 and Zechariah 3 is not the devil. Recall that Hebrew does not tolerate the definite article before a personal proper name. As was the case throughout Job 1 and 2, the definite article is present with Satan in Zechariah 3. End note. There is another possible point of reference for the content of Jude 9 that potentially redeems Baucham's conclusion. According to Deuteronomy 34:6, God buried Moses in the valley in the land of Moab opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows the place of his burial to this day. The location has significance for Israelite cosmology and religion. This location is part of the geographical area that includes Oboth and Abarim. Mount Nebo, the mountaintop atop which Moses viewed the Promised Land before God laid him to rest, is in fact explicitly linked to Abarim in Deuteronomy 32:49. These locations were associated with the underworld and ancient cults of the dead. Consequently, the valley mentioned in Deuteronomy 34:6 may well be the valley of the Obarim mentioned in Ezekiel 39:11. Spronk discusses the place names. The participle cal plural Obarim of the verb yibur, to pass from one side to the other, seems to have a special meaning in the context of the cult of the dead, denoting the spirits of the dead crossing the border between the land of the living and the world of the dead. It can be interpreted as a divine name in Ezekiel 39:11 and 14, which may have also been preserved in the geographical name Abarim. Its Ugaritic cognate, then, would be Yibarim in Die Keil-alphabetischen Texte aus Ugarit, KTU 2, 1.22.1, paragraph 15. In the Ugaritic text, KTU 2, 1.22, describing a necromantic session, the king invokes the spirits of the dead, Rephaim, and celebrates a feast, probably the New Year festival, with them. It is told that they came over traveling by horse-drawn chariots. As they are taking part in the meal served for them, they are explicitly called those who came over. The valley of the Obarim is located east of the sea, which is probably the Dead Sea, so it was part of Transjordan. This is a region which shows many traces of ancient cults of the dead, such as the megalithic monuments called dolmens, and place names referring to the dead and the netherworld, vis-à-vis Obit, Peor, and Abarim. In view of this data, it seems reasonable to conclude that Moses would have been buried in the place associated with the realm of the dead. It is, in turn, quite understandable if a Second Temple Jewish tradition arose about the body of Moses, arguably the central figure in Israelite history, being contested by the Lord of the Dead, Satan, by the time of that period. Michael was Israel's prince, the guardian of Yahweh's portion, according to Daniel 10 and 12, so he would be the logical candidate to claim the body of Moses for the eschatological land of promise, or the domain of Yahweh in the afterlife. New Testament writers utilize other functional terms, some of which, as noted earlier, also describe fallen supernatural beings. Paul referred to the supernatural beings appointed by God over the nations as rulers, thrones, dominions, and authorities hostile to God. Note: I take Ephesians 1:21 as referring to the defeat of supernatural hostile powers due to its link to the resurrection. The New Testament links the triumph of the resurrection with the delegitimization of the powers of darkness put over the nations at the Babel judgment in several passages. These thoughts in tandem call the Gentiles to leave the spiritual rulers whose authority originated with Yahweh and turn back to Yahweh once more in response to the work of Christ, the seed of Abraham, through whom the nations would be blessed. End note. He also used these terms more neutrally. In Colossians 1:16, God is credited with creating all things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. The verse's use of these terms to refer to spiritual, disembodied, invisible beings as they were created, informs us that they were intended by God to be overseers and administrators on His behalf. In Ephesians 3:10, we cannot presume that only the fallen rulers and authorities learned the fullness of the wisdom of God's salvation plan. Note, it is interesting that rulers, archai, is juxtaposed with angels in Romans 8:38. Since the other pairings in Romans 8:38-39 are oppositional, rulers here is negative, being paired contrastively with angels, the stock term for loyal members of the heavenly host. The powers of the age to come, in Hebrews 6:5, aligned with the goodness of the Word of God in the writer's thought, is likely a reference to spiritual gifts, or the experience of God's inaugurated kingdom, not supernatural beings. Endnote. The spiritual authority, kuriotes, of 2 Peter 2:10 and Jude 8, reject authority and blaspheme the glorious ones, is arguably God, though, as discussed below, it could refer to the heavenly council with God. If the latter option is coherent, the spiritual authorities referred to are obviously loyal members of the heavenly host. Chapter 6, Part 2. New Testament Angelology, Natures, Abilities, Status. The nature and abilities of God's loyal heavenly host extend from the ontological language we noted above. Angels are disembodied supernatural spirits. Hebrews 1:7 quotes Psalm 104:4 in this regard, characterizing angels as winds and flames of fire, whereas the psalmist utilized the term ruchot, which often speaks of a supernatural entity, so the writer of Hebrews employs pneumata, which is often used in the same way. 7 verses later, the writer refers to these entities as ministering spirits, pneumata. As disembodied beings, angels have no need of physical procreation, though they can assume physical form and appear as men. Note, Matthew 22:30 and Mark 12:25 do not undermine interpreting, with Peter and Jude, for example, the sons of God of Genesis 6:1-4 as supernatural beings. As I noted in The Unseen Realm, the text does not say angels cannot have sexual intercourse, it says they don't. The reason ought to be obvious. The context for the statement is the resurrection, which refers either broadly to the afterlife or, more precisely, to the final renewed global Eden. The point is clear in either option. In the spiritual world, the realm of divine beings, there is no need for procreation. Procreation is part of the embodied world and is necessary to maintain the physical population. In like manner, life in the perfected Edenic world also does not require maintaining the human species by having children. Everyone has an immortal resurrection body. Consequently, there is no need for sex in the resurrection, just as there is no need for it in the non-human spiritual realm. Endnote. Their disembodied spiritual nature is apparently what makes them greater in might and power than humans. Note, the objects of this comparative statement in 2 Peter 2:11 are human false teachers. Endnote. That a spirit existence was considered superior to embodiment is indicated by certain statements about the incarnation of the second person of the Godhead as Jesus of Nazareth. Philippians 2:5-8 describes the incarnation as an act of humility and condescension. The writer of Hebrews informs us that the incarnation resulted in the Son of God being made a little lower than the angels. Note, the writer of Hebrews is quoting Psalm 8:5, 8:6 in the Septuagint, the source of the quotation. The Hebrew text reads Elohim, which the Septuagint translator took as a plural. As noted in chapter 1, Elohim is a general term that is broadly used in the Hebrew Bible to describe a disembodied resident of the spiritual world. Endnote. This secondary status was temporary. After his resurrection and subsequent ascension, Christ became as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs, with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him. Despite having this exceptional nature, angels do not know everything. They are not omniscient. They do not know at what time Jesus will return, and didn't know precisely how God's salvation plan would work out. As was the case in the Old Testament, angels are not considered infallible. Paul's comments in 1 Corinthians 11:10 indicate that Paul feared angels could be tempted. In discussing why women should have their head covered and the fact that a woman's hair was given to her as a covering, Paul advises that women should heed his words because of the angels. Recent scholarship has shown that in the Greco-Roman worldview, of which Corinth was obviously a part, Paul's discussion of these items is inherently sexual in nature, ultimately having to do with conceiving children. Note: Troy W. Martin argues the word for covering in 1 Corinthians 11:15b, paraboleon, is frequently used for male testicles. Troy Martin, whose specialty is Greco-Roman medical literature, marshals numerous examples in his research toward arguing that Paul's discussion in 1 Corinthians 11 was a plea for modesty and sexual fidelity, themes that were certainly needed in the Corinthian church. In his first article, Martin explained, ancient medical conceptions confirm this association. Hippocratic authors hold that hair is hollow and grows primarily from either male or female reproductive fluid or semen flowing into it and congealing. Since hollow body parts create a vacuum and attract fluid, hair attracts semen. Hair grows most prolifically from the head because the brain is the place where the semen is produced, or at least stored. Hair grows only on the head of prepubescent humans because semen is stored in the brain, and the channels of the body have not yet become large enough for reproductive fluid to travel through the body. At puberty, secondary hair growth in the pubic area marks the movement of reproductive fluid from the brain to the rest of the body. Women have less body hair not only because they have less semen, but also because their colder bodies do not froth the semen throughout their bodies to reduce semen evaporation at the ends of their hair. According to these medical authors, men have more hair because they have more semen, and their hotter bodies froth this semen more readily throughout their whole bodies. The nature of men is to release or eject the semen. A man with long hair retains much or all of his semen, and his long hollow hair draws the semen toward his head area but away from his genital area where it should be ejected. Therefore, 1 Corinthians 11:14 correctly states that it is a shame for a man to have long hair, since the male nature is to eject rather than retain semen. In contrast, the nature of women is to draw up the semen and congeal it into a fetus. This conception of hair as part of the female genitalia explains the favorite Hippocratic test for sterility in women. A doctor places a scented suppository in the woman's uterus and examines her mouth the next day to see if he can smell the scent of the suppository. If he smells the scent, he diagnoses her as fertile. If he does not smell the scent, he concludes she is sterile because the channels connecting her uterus to her head are blocked. The suction power of the hair cannot draw up the semen through the appropriate channels in her body. The male seed is therefore discharged rather than retained, and the woman cannot conceive. End note. As Stuckenbrook has observed, the sexual nature of Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians 11:2-16 is an echo of the sin of the Watchers in 1 Enoch, the well-known Second Temple Jewish retelling of the violation of the cosmic order in Genesis 6:1-4. Note: Tertullian is an example of an early church leader who made this same connection. It is on account of the angels, he says, that the woman's head is to be covered, because the angels revolted from God on account of the daughters of men. End note. Stuckenbrook has analyzed and critiqued the three primary scholarly proposals for understanding 1 Corinthians 11:2-16 in considerable detail. After demonstrating the deficiencies of these approaches, Stuckenbrook marshals a number of primary sources in his defense of a connection between the passage and Genesis 6:1-4 and 1 Enoch's Watcher story. He writes, although the wearing of head coverings among men in antiquity was not uncommon, the practice among women carried with it strong sexual connotations. Apparel was, of course, one way of marking the differences, or better, boundaries between the sexes, that is, to keep gender categories distinct. The notion in Greco-Roman antiquity of female vulnerability and inferiority assumed in many Jewish sources, and the attendant practice of prophylactic head covering fit well with the early Jewish mythological interpretations of Genesis 6:1-4. With regard to this, New Testament scholars have customarily focused on the essentially evil character of the angels who fell because they were attracted by the beauty of the human daughters. This would be much in line with the Book of Watchers of 1 Enoch and the Book of Giants. Paul's reasons for commending head coverings are unable to break away from the deep-seated assumption that women constitute the locus where boundaries between different parts of the cosmos are most likely to be violated. Paul's reference to the angels betrays a subtle warning that more than just social relationships between men and women are at stake. Ultimately, wearing veils is a matter of maintaining the cosmic order. The head coverings are prophylactic in the sense that they protect this order by helping to draw boundaries between distinct, yet sometimes socially overlapping spheres more clearly. These boundaries, which have structured the universe since creation, are to be respected. The head coverings also function to keep women distinct from the angels who, for the sake of this argument, are considered an essentially different order of creation. What this means for our purposes is that Paul was worried that angels could fall again. The incident in Genesis 6:1-4 was considered by Second Temple Jewish writers to be the main catalyst to human depravity, and so Paul's concern would be understandable. Note, the main problem stemming from Genesis 6:1-4 was not the Nephilim for Second Temple Jews. While demons were considered the Watcher spirits disembodied at the death of Nephilim, the primary theological concern deriving from this pre-flood transgression was what the Watchers taught humanity, leading to human self-destruction and idolatry. Endnote. As fallible beings, it is no surprise that angels were not the agents of salvation. Rather, angels are cast as curious observers of God's plan of salvation, not privy to all its details. Concerning this salvation, the prophets who prophesied about the grace that was to be yours searched and inquired carefully, inquiring what person or time the Spirit of Christ in them was indicating when he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the subsequent glories. It was revealed to them that they were serving not themselves but you in the things that have now been announced to you through those who preach the good news to you by the Holy Spirit sent from heaven, things into which angels long to look. 1 Peter 1:10-12. The passage reminds us that a divine nature does not translate to omniscience. Like humans, angels are imagers of God and therefore share his attributes, but neither possess them fully or have God's perfect nature. Note, I discussed this at length in the unseen realm. Based on several points of Hebrew grammar and syntax, the image of God should not be understood as a quality or attribute. Rather, it refers to representational status. We don't possess a thing called the image. We are the image of God. We are therefore imagers of God. The plural language of Genesis 1:26-27, let us create humankind in or as our image, signifies that the members of the heavenly host are also created imagers of God, representing him in the spiritual world like humans do on earth. Sharing God's attributes enable that representation, imaging. As I wrote in the unseen realm, many Bible readers note the plural pronouns us, our, with curiosity. They might suggest that the plurals refer to the Trinity, but technical research in Hebrew grammar and exegesis has shown that the Trinity is not a coherent explanation. The solution is much more straightforward, one that an ancient Israelite would have readily discerned. What we have is a single person, God, addressing a group, the members of the divine council. Elsewhere in the unseen realm, I establish the idea of a Godhead is indeed present in the Old Testament, but not in Genesis 1:26. Theologically, if the three persons of the Godhead are co-eternal and co-omniscient, there would be no need for God to inform the other persons of his decision to create humankind. They would already know, and would have been part of the decision. Endnote. We can clearly discern that angels are intelligent beings, both in their obedient service and self-willed rebellion. They are also emotional beings, as they rejoice when sinners believe. Loyal angels are aware of their lesser status in this regard, and so they refuse the worship of humans in the New Testament. Then I fell down at his feet to worship him, but he said to me, You must not do that. I am a fellow servant with you and your brothers who hold to the testimony of Jesus. Worship God, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. Revelation 19:10. I, John, am the one who heard and saw these things, and when I heard and saw them I fell down to worship at the feet of the angel who showed them to me. But he said to me, You must not do that. I am a fellow servant with you and your brothers, the prophets, and with those who keep the words of this book. Worship God. Revelation 22:8-9. Scholars have noted that this New Testament idea is not unique. In addition to the passages in Revelation, the motif of an angel refusing worship by a seer in a visionary encounter is preserved in the Second Temple period in a number of Jewish Christian, and Christian writings. These are presently listed with the names of the angelic figures. Tobit 12:16-22, Raphael. Apocalypse of Zephaniah 6:11-15, Eremiel. Ascension of Isaiah 7:2, a glorious angel. 7:18-23, one seated on a throne. 8:1-10 and 15. 2 Enoch 1:4-8, two huge men. 3 Enoch 1:7, Prince of the Chariot, and 16:1-5, Metatron. Karyogenesa fragment, TSK 21.95.C. Zehobadiah, Youth, Metatron. Apocryphal Gospel of Matthew 3:3, an angel of God. Note: some Christian traditions, Roman Catholicism, and the Orthodox Church distinguish worship from veneration, adoration, and permit the latter practice with respect to angels. End note. Not only do angels refuse worship, but in concert with the greatest commandment, humans are not to worship them. Their divine status does not entitle them to worship due only to the Most High God. Paul encountered some sort of angelic worship at Colossae and addressed it in Colossians 2:18-23. Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with a growth that is from God. If with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations, do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, referring to things that all perish as they are used, according to human precepts and teachings? These have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. The phrase translated worship of angels, thrasekia ton angelon, has generated some disagreement among scholars. Does the phrase describe worship given to angels, in other words, they are the object, or participation with angels in their worship? One scholar summarizes the options this way. The phrase has normally been taken, with the genitive being regarded as objective, to denote the worship directed to the angels. This statement concerning angel worship seems to go beyond speculation about angels present in the Jewish schools and denotes an actual cult of angels. The principalities and powers might have been in view, but Paul here refers to angels as a class. There is little evidence for the worship of angels among the Jews, and so it is argued that the expression is evidence of the syncretistic character of the philosophy at Colossae. It was Jewish mixed with pagan elements. The angels determined the course of the cosmos, and with it man's circumstances. Men submitted to the angels in the cult by performing the prescribed acts and by filling the regulations laid down. Francis, on the other hand, has argued that the phrase, taking the genitive as subjective, denotes the worship which the angels perform. Using a wide range of sources representing what he terms ascetic mystic piety, Francis drew attention to the many descriptions of angelic worship. Participation in the angelic worship is detailed in several sources. So Isaiah participates in the worship of the 5th, 6th, and 7th heavens, while the daughters of Job praise and glorify God in an angelic tongue. Frequently, the Qumran literature refers to the members of the community as priests who offer sacrifice, which equals the Qumran way of life, not only before Yahweh, but also in communion with the angels. Accordingly, the false teachers claim to have joined in the angelic worship of God as they entered into the heavenly realm and prepared to receive visions of divine mysteries. No matter the alternative, Paul's warning is comprehensible. Angels are neither the correct object of worship, nor is the worship of God defined by religious performance. Paul was clear that spiritual worship was about the heart, sacrificially presenting one's life to Christ, not being conformed to the world, but being transformed by a renewed mind or heart. Angels will actually be in a subservient status to glorified believers in the eschaton. The writer of Hebrews notes, "It was not to angels that God subjected the world to come," a thought that is to be framed by Paul's exhortation declaring that believers will judge angels. Paul is referencing the fact that the fallen spiritual beings who presently rule the nations will be replaced by believers. The point is made twice in the book of Revelation. "The one who conquers and who keeps my works until the end, to him I will give authority over the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron, as when earthen pots are broken in pieces, even as I myself have received authority from my Father, and I will give him the morning star." Revelation 2:26-28. "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in to him and eat with him, and he with me. The one who conquers, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne, as I also conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne." Revelation 3:20-21. The point of these passages is that we share the rule of the nations with Christ as his family members. Numbers 24:17 says, "A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter will rise out of Israel." That text was considered messianic in Second Temple Judaism. While its royal nature is obvious, a scepter will rise, we need to remember that divine beings are referred to as stars. The morning star language in Revelation makes complete sense in conveying the rule of a divine Messiah. The idea is even more explicit in Revelation 22:16. "I am the root and the descendant of David, the bright morning star." Incredibly, John has Jesus refer to his followers the same way in Revelation 2:28. "I will give him who overcomes the morning star." Believers have the authority to rule with Christ.